Hello and welcome to the session, The Many Faces of Race in Louisiana History for the Louisiana Historical Association. I am Edith Ambrose and I will chair this session. And so with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first presenter, who is Jeffrey E. Anderson from the University of Louisiana at Monroe. And I'll turn it over to you, Jeffrey.
Thank you, everybody. This is a new thing for me, like it probably is for some of you, so hopefully it'll go off without too much of a hitch. Well, I'm speaking about Monsieur Danny and Grand Zombie, African serpent spirits in the Mississippi Valley. At the heart of what made the religion of Mississippi Valley voodoo distinct from that of both the Christian majority and its historical antecedents were its deities. One consequence of the death of voodoo as an intact living religion is that producing a complete catalog of the spirit world is no longer possible. Fortunately, enough fragmentary evidence exists to examine the gods whose names have survived in light of the much more plentiful information on their likely African forebears and Caribbean relatives. Close study of individual serpent spirits, such as Monsieur Danny and Grand Zombie, makes clear that by the late 19th century, the version of voodoo found in the New Orleans area continued to share many commonalities with its African and Haitian cousins, even though it was clearly developing along distinct lines. Among the most commonly mentioned deities in Louisiana voodoo was a spirit known variously as Monsieur Danny, Daniel Blanc, or Blanc Denis. The first work to mention him by name was George Washington Cable's novel, The Grandissimes, which appeared in 1880. Its brief reference to the voodoo deity merely described him as, and I quote, the head imp of discord, and suggested that the superstitious might credit him with some unpleasant weather described at that point in the book. 5 years later, famed journalist Lafcadio Hearn referenced a song which he described as one that, and I quote, used to be sung by Louisiana field hands, which I'm just about to put up on the screen for you to see. All right, that ought to be visible too. Hearn did not recognize that this Danier was a voodoo god. He translated the first line of the song as, all the country white man's country, Daniel has so commanded. The second and third lines can be translated as, Daniel has so commanded that, Daniel has so commanded. The journalist went on to speculate that perhaps the song referred to the biblical Daniel. That Hearn's Danier was almost certainly not the prophet Daniel can be confirmed by a second record of the song that appeared in a 1904 novel by Helen Pitkin called An Angel by Brevet. Her version reads, is shown below. It can be translated as, White Danny and all the whites' country, there you rule. White Danny and all the whites' country, there you rule. In this fictional account, which the author claimed was firmly rooted in fact, the song is part of a voodoo ceremony, and participants in this fictional ceremony described as being so honored as a great spirit and a white man. Monsieur Danny is a Creole version of the Fon and Ewe deity Don or Da, most prominently associated with the city of Ouida in modern-day Benin. The city was once part of a small coastal kingdom, which was conquered by the expansionist kingdom of Dahomey in 1727. Don, envisioned as a heavenly python, was the primary deity of Ouida, and following its fall became a major god in Dahomey as well. According to area traditions, the deity is ancient, having existed in the creation of the universe, and also maintains the motion and stability of it to the present. In its relationship with humankind, Don is benevolent and associated with wisdom. And then today, the spirit is also prominently connected to wealth and prosperity. Often, Don is understood as androgynous or as part of a pair with a second serpent associated with the sky called Iyidowedo, who is visible as a rainbow. The Haitian version of Monsieur Danny, Dambalawedo, maintains many of its African characteristics. New World believers frequently understood him as both a serpent of the earth and sky, and also as the husband of the heavenly rainbow serpent, Iyidowedo, like in Benin. In both its original homeland and in Haiti, Don Dambala is particularly associated with the color white. As with many another voodoo spirit, the precise role of Danny in Louisiana is obscure. The multiple references to him and the surviving song, which speaks of him commanding in a country of the whites, demonstrate that he was of considerable importance. Like his African and Haitian counterparts, it was also true there. Moreover, Dan and Dambala's association with the color white provided a route to his interpretation as a Caucasian man. On the other hand, George Washington Cable's identification of him as a spirit of discord was likely either an error or captured only one aspect of a broader role as a mover of the atmosphere. If Cable indeed meant to imply that Danny had a role in the workings of the weather, then this description was not out of keeping with African antecedents. Curiously absent from direct references to Monsieur Danny are descriptions of him as a serpent. That believers did consider him in that light, however, is indicated indirectly by the reported prominence of snakes in voodoo ritual. For example, an 1875 account of a ceremony that supposedly took place in 1825 describes a man assisting the presiding priestess by holding aloft a very large red and black snake of some indeterminate species, speaking to it, passing over the heads of participants, things like that. With each pass, he would repeat the name Voodoo Magnon, which is probably not a name, but more of a title. Decades later, Charles Raphael, who was interviewed by Federal Writer Project workers, told his interviewers that Marie Laveau actually never used live snakes, but called upon what he called the spirit of the snake in her rituals. Though no observers who actually witnessed a voodoo ceremony specifically said this snake spirit was Donnie, the historical background of the deity renders it very likely they were one and the same. Though the identification of Monsieur Danny with a white man may at first seem to argue against this conclusion, a similar situation exists with Haiti's Dambala, whom believers identify with St. Patrick, while simultaneously considering him a serpent loa, or spirit. Another Louisiana voodoo deity strongly associated with serpents was Grand Zombie. This spirit's precise characteristics are hard to come by in the documentary record as well. An 1890 article in New Orleans Daily Picayune described Grand Zombie as, and I quote, the mysterious power which guards and overshadows followers of voodoo. The anonymous author went on to portray it as particularly associated with the city's Congo Square, the making of Gris-Gris, and death. 2 years later, the fictional short story Clopin Clopin, also published in the Daily Picayune, spoke of it as a vengeful spirit from the former colony of Saint-Domingue that brought misfortune and death with it when it arrived in New Orleans with refugees who had fled the Haitian Revolution. An 1894 news article from the same paper linked him to the making of magical items and claimed that African-American New Orleanians called upon him to help end the drought. Live snakes figured prominently in apparent connection with Grand Zombie in an accompanying description of a St. John's Eve ceremony. Much later, an informant interviewed by Federal Writers Project workers stated that Zombie was the name of a snake that Marie Laveau, New Orleans' most famous voodoo priestess, kept to work magic of many sorts. The name Grand Zombie means something akin to Great Spirit in Louisiana French, meaning that it could well be a praise name or a title for another spirit, potentially even Monsieur Danny. The word zombie, however, is probably of West Central African origin rather than from the Fon and Ewe languages from which Danny derived. Scholar of New Orleans voodoo Carolyn Morial connected the deity with Nzambe Atumpungu, supreme creator god of the West Central African Bakongo people group. If this link is accurate, the historical similarity between the status and function of Nzambe Atumpungu with those of Don would have provided potential grounds for merging the two in North America. On the other hand, among the Bakongo, Nzambe can also refer to a dead person when followed by that person's name, meaning that Grand Zombie could conceivably be a particularly important ancestral spirit. Alternatively, Grand Zombie could well derive from some other term, most likely one originating in the language of the Bakongo or some other related West African people group. A prime candidate is Simbi, a general term for water spirits that could easily find itself written as zombie when recorded by a French or English-speaking American unfamiliar with it. That Grand Zombie could have begun as a Simbi is indirectly supported by a parallel situation in Haiti where a family of Loa known as Simbi survives. One of their number is known as Grand Simba and is the ancestor of the rest of the group. Moreover, while various members of the family are either associated with white and or are envisioned as serpents, they are not identical with Dambala. This Grand Zombie and Simbi interpretation may be embodied with the oldest surviving voodoo song from the Mississippi River Valley, which I'm putting up on my screen now. This song, which appeared in a pro-union newspaper in 1863, was reportedly part of a ceremony during which participants called upon a spirit the journalists referred to as the Grand Simbe. The similarity in name and title meaning great suggests that it might well be a French form of a name later anglicized as Grand Zombie. Alexis Alarcon, an expert on both Haitian Vodou and Cuban Vodou, suggests that the song was a petition for aid to one of the spirits known in both Haiti and Cuba as Simbi, lending further support to this idea. Further complicating matters is the fact that a Jean Zombie exists among the Loa of Haiti and the Loa of Cuba. This spirit reportedly began its existence as an actual historical figure during the days of the Haitian Revolution, when he was best known for killing French settlers. It is highly likely that this man intentionally drew on a Bakongo term, most likely in zombie, used in the context of spirits of the dead, for his surname. Later generations would deify him. In modern Haiti, Jean Zombie is one of the Gede Loa who are associated with death, though he is not a particularly prominent member of the Gede family. Descendants of Haitians living in Cuba, whose ancestors immigrated to the area surrounding Santiago during the first half of the 20th century, give a lot greater prominence to the Gede Loa they know as Zombie. He is the owner of cemeteries and allows sorcerers to make zombies of the Walking Dead variety, and as such, he is highly respected but also avoided. A final possibility, suggested by Carolyn Morial Long, is that Grand Zombie was a creation of journalists who had heard stories of zombies, Haitian or otherwise. On the surface, this seems unlikely considering the difference between Louisiana's deity and the Walking Dead of Haiti. Moreover, the word zombie was part of Louisianans' vocabulary before the first reference to Grand Zombie. For instance, the word zombie appears in Cable's Grandissimes, where it meant spirit in 1880. Also, an author styling himself J.A. used it similarly in a French poem he published in New Orleans Times-Democrat in 1886, where he translated it as specter. It also appeared in a collection of folk tales originally published in 1887, but there it meant wizard. Nevertheless, it is just possible that the term could have been introduced into French during the late 19th century and quickly fashioned into an imagined voodoo deity. Published stories in English-language newspapers, for instance, sometimes mention beings known as zombies. A story initially called The Unknown Painter and featuring a spirit called the Zombie began to circulate in American newspapers, beginning with its printing in an 1838 edition of the Wilmington Advertiser. Over the years, variations appeared in many other periodicals across the nation through the 1890s. Another fictional tale that referenced a being called Zombie appeared as A Romance of Martinique in a Pennsylvania newspaper in 1879. Several others across the nation reprinted it in short order as well. The timing of the references was such that the word zombie could have conceivably gained currency in the lower Mississippi River Valley through fictional accounts of this other spirit. While each of these theories of the origin of Grand Zombie has something in its favor, none of them is demonstrably the best explanation. The evidence, such as it is, points toward one of two mixed interpretations. First, Grand Zombie may have begun its existence as what the 1863 article called the Grand Simbe. Authors writing in English, already familiar with the word zombie, may well have used it to express the spoken Simbe. In this sense, the name Grand Zombie may have been an unintentional creation of journalists that they applied to a similarly named spirit. On the other hand, it is entirely possible that Grand Zombie and Simbe, like Jean Zombie and the various Simbi of Haiti, were completely distinct beings, each with its own origin in West Central Africa and or Haiti. So, what does this examination of serpent deities in Louisiana tell us? First, it shows us just how difficult working with fragmentary sources can be, and how tentative must be any conclusions drawn from them. Despite these challenges, it can also give us considerable insight into just how the Crescent City's African-American culture developed. For instance, just how strong was the Haitian cultural influence following the massive 1809-1810 influx of immigrants, which roughly doubled the city's population? Voodoo bears apparent marks of that immigration. Monsieur Danny, along with deities like Papa Leba, Verikite, they can be found in some form among Haiti's Rada nation of spirits as Dombalawedo, Legba, and Ezanvelekite, respectively. Meanwhile, Simbe, Grand Zombie, have Haitian counterparts within the Simbi and or Gede families of Haitian divinities. Despite the similarities, however, there are important differences between the gods of New Orleans and Haiti, pointing perhaps to an African heritage that survived outside of the Haitian filter. At the most basic level, names differ in pronunciation. Monsieur Danny, for instance, is not easily recognizable as Dombalawedo, without the benefit of historical context. In addition, the Mississippi Valley pronunciation strongly resembles the name of the deity's African counterpart, Don or Da, sometimes recorded as Yangvi, which roughly translates as life-giving snake. Similarly, differences in deity's prominence in New Orleans as compared to Haiti at least reflect a strong, distinct development, if nothing else. While divinities like Monsieur Danny and Dambala held roughly the same importance in both the Mississippi Valley and Haiti, such was not the case for others. Grand Zombie was much more prominent in New Orleans than among Haitians, and held a status even greater than that possessed by Zombie of Cuba. Along similar lines, the word Loa, a general term for Haitian divinities, is completely absent from the primary sources that address Louisiana voodoo. Ultimately, the complex interactions of the slave trade, immigration, and cultural formation as they relate to voodoo cannot be fully explored because of the paucity of reliable sources and because I'm about out of time. Nevertheless, the study of the religion does provide us with some indicators of ways in which recent immigrants from the Caribbean interacted with the descendants of West and West Central Africans already in the area, and provides insight into the blending of what were once distinct African cultural traditions into a religion embraced by slaves, free African Americans, and their descendants in 19th and early 20th century New Orleans. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. So I am now going to read the next paper on the schedule that my colleague Ronald Traylor from Southeastern Louisiana University wrote, and he regrets that he won't be here, but he's recently lost his wife, and so with grief, he has asked that I read the paper for him. So I'm going to try to do justice to Dr. Traylor's paper. And its title is Black and White Louisianians and Their Texas Connection. While the printed title of this paper is Black and White Louisianians and Their Texas Connection, full disclosure demands that the title be expanded to include the state of Maryland. The small Southeast Texas Black majority town of Barrett Station lies some 20 miles east of the city of Houston. Founded after the Civil War by the Barretts, a family of former slaves, the community developed not as the Black section of a white town, but rather as a separately and independently created neighborhood that grew toward and ultimately came to share a common boundary with the white majority town of Crosby. Created by freedmen with strong Louisiana roots and later augmented by two waves of Black Louisianians during and after World War I, Barrett Station has existed for a century and a half to provide a sanctuary for Black citizens. The land upon which the community sits has a human story that predates the establishment of the Republic of Texas. Shortly after Spanish rule ended as the result of the Mexican Revolution, the American impresario Stephen F. Austin set about forming a colony of settlers. Some 297 families honored thereafter in Texas history as the Old 300 responded to Austin's announcement of the formation of the colony. The eventual establishment of the towns of Barrett Station and Crosby occurred on land granted by the Mexican government through Austin to two of those early settlers. One, Reuben White, became the first Anglo owner of the land upon which Barrett Station stands today. Born in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, and a veteran of the War of 1812, White moved to Texas in 1824. Through Stephen F. Austin, he received property on the east bank of the San Jacinto River. The land of Humphrey Jackson, the second member of the Old 300, played no role in the actual establishment of Barrett Station, but rather led to the development of the nearby white majority town of Crosby. A native of Belfast, Ireland, in 1808, Jackson settled in the area that later became the state of Louisiana, and he fought in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. He moved to Texas even earlier than Reuben White, arriving in 1823. The family also settled on the east bank of the San Jacinto River. Harrison Barrett, a 15-year-old freedman when freedom came, is given credit for the founding of the modern community of Barrett Station. His father, Simon Barrett, was born in Louisiana in about 1823. The name of his mother is unknown, and we do not know where she lived prior to his birth. The Barrett family tradition not only supports Simon's Louisiana birthplace, but adds to it by saying that he lived near Shreveport in his youth. Census records in which Simon Barrett's wife, Eliza Barrett, later testified showed the state of Maryland as the state of her birth in about 1820. The obvious germane question is clear. How did a slave man from Louisiana meet and marry a slave woman from Maryland? Solving the mystery requires an understanding of the changes that impacted tobacco, the traditional staple crop of Maryland, the state of her birth. In those days of unscientific farming, tobacco tended to exhaust the soil in the long run. Fortunately for the landowner, depleted soil that no longer fit tobacco is perfectly suitable for the cultivation of other crops. So, Maryland farmers made a staple crop transition that also prompted labor changes as well. None of the new crops required the high amount of labor demanded by tobacco. So slave owners with a surplus of slaves addressed the surplus in several ways. Some simply freed their bondsmen, leasing slaves with marketable skills to whites who needed those services provided another option. Third was to sell the slaves on the open market. The time during which Maryland began to experience the soil degradation that inexorably led to the excess slave population generally coincided with the perfection of the cotton gin. So after the cotton gin made the process of separating cotton seed from cotton fiber rather simple, cotton cultivation spread rapidly, especially in the states of the lower South and the Southwest. An increase in labor demands accompanied that increase in cotton, and the internal slave trade bore the burden of providing those additional slaves. Many such slaves came from the Chesapeake, now a net slave exporting area. This new reality probably led Eliza Barrett's Maryland master to sell her, prompting the circumstances which led to her arrival in Louisiana and eventually to Texas. The antebellum city of New Orleans became the largest slave market in the United States, and it's likely that Eliza was sold there. After the purchase, her new owner, likely from either Louisiana or Texas, removed her to her new home. A close examination of the census records gives a rather clear date for her arrival in Louisiana. But first, we need to bring in another thread of the tapestry that illustrates the life of Simon and Eliza Barrett. Not only do we know that the Marylander Eliza eventually married the Louisianian Simon Barrett, but we also know that she bore a child to another man prior to her marriage to Barrett. But when and where did that birth take place? In the census of 1880, Mark Eagleton, that child, now grown to adulthood and 45 years of age, gave 1835 as his birth year and Louisiana as his birth state. That date proves Eliza's presence in Louisiana by at least 1835 and made her no more than 15 years old when she gave birth to Mac Eagleton. On that same census, Eagleton gave Maryland as the birth state of both his mother and his father. Whether the father of Mac Eagleton was white or black cannot be proven, but the census of 1870 recognized Eagleton as a mulatto, a light-skinned black man. Therefore, it is almost certain that Mac Eagleton's father was white. A white man from Maryland fathered Mac Eagleton, Eliza's first child, and did so when she herself was little more than a child. But what of Simon Barrett? The primary documents indicate that Simon was born in Louisiana. In 1867, the post-Civil War freedman Simon Barrett registered to vote for the first time. Answering the questions contained on the registration form, he claimed to have been in Texas for 24 years, which means he relocated from Louisiana to Texas in about 1843 as a 20-year-old slave. Additionally, on the same paperwork, He testified to having lived since 1854 in that part of Liberty County, Texas, that in 1858 became Chambers County. The family oral tradition asserted that one man owned the entire family, and that at some point during the Civil War, he not only sold them all, but sold them to different people. The oral tradition insisted that prior to that diaspora, the entire family lived near present-day Barrett Station in eastern Harris County. It also emphatically said that all of the family, that of all the family, only Harrison, the couple's second child and oldest son, remained in the original area after the scattering of the family. He spent years during Reconstruction in an attempt to find and reunite the family, and research into the matter yields a very interesting point that is reflective of the data contained within the primary documents from that period. Recall that Simon Barrett, Harrison's father, claimed a Texas residency that began in 1843. When he registered to vote in 1867 in Chambers County, Texas, a number of revealing names appeared immediately above and below his on the registration sheet, including those of Benjamin Barrow and his nephew, Solomon Barrow, Jr. The Barrow family, from which both men descended, played an important role in early Texas history when Texas served as the northeasternmost province of Mexico. Solomon Barrow Jr.'s father, Solomon Sr., received one of the earliest land grants on record from the Mexican government, and he moved his family from Louisiana to that part of the upper Texas Gulf Coast called Trinity Bay and settled near Turtle Bayou in Liberty, later Chambers County. Solomon Barrow Sr. met an untimely death in January 1858. According to the commonly accepted story, Margaret, a mulatto slave girl, put arsenic in Barrow's food as revenge for Barrow's broken promise of freedom for her. Interestingly, the all-white jury split in the attempt to reach a verdict. The judge returned her to slavery, at which point the Barrows sold her to the owner of another plantation. For whatever the reason, but certainly in part to his unexpected demise, Solomon Barrow Sr. died without a will. So the possessions of Texans in antebellum times included three categories of livestock and slaves. The livestock division occurred first, then the slaves, and no one in the family except Solomon Barrow owned slaves before his death, except for one son-in-law. But by the time the division of slaves was complete, all the children except one, a son named Allen, who received extra land in lieu of chattels, owned slaves. I'm running over time. I'm going to try to shorten this a little bit. The unexpected division of the family estate due to the untimely, oh wait, I already read that. Okay, the 1870 census indicated that Simon Barrett, his wife Eliza, and their two young sons, Frank and Tobias, still lived near Turtle Bayou in Chambers County, Texas in 1870. According to the voter registration data, it is certain that they had lived there at least as early as 1867, and likely that they had lived there since the 1850s. Other children of the Simon and Eliza Barrett family, such as their adult daughter Jane, appeared on the Chambers County Census of 1870 as well. All the members of the Simon Barrett family, except for Mac Eagleton and Harris Barrett, the two oldest sons, lived in Chambers County, Texas, according to the census and primary documents. The name of Harrison Barrett appeared on that census. Amazingly, Harrison Barrett's next door neighbor, living just a few houses down the road, proved to be his half-brother, Mac Eagleton. Another obvious question presents itself. How did Harrison Barrett and Mac Eagleton get from Turtle Bayou in Chambers County to eastern Harris County near the San Jacinto River, a distance of some 25 miles? The 1870 census tells us that right up the road from the homes of those two men lived Reuben Barrow Jr., the younger brother of Solomon Barrow Sr., the man who in all probability owned the Barrett family prior to his death. I do not believe in coincidences and suggest that the division of Solomon Barrow Sr.'s slaves extended beyond his widow and his children, the principal recipients. His younger brother, Reuben, therefore either inherited or bought Harrison and Mack and moved them with him to his property in Harris County. Until the early 19th century, most residents of Barrett Station were not only members of the Barrett family and longtime Texans. The demographics of the Barrett Station Crosby community began to change during World War I, as a small group of Louisiana natives moved into the community. In all likelihood, this movement was a side shoot of the Great Migration of Blacks from the rural South to the North, but many also moved to the industrialized Houston area in the same migration. Houston experienced a considerable economic expansion during the World War I era as the city became a center for the oil and refining industry. Then as now, much of the city's industrial heart lay on the ship channel, located in the south and the east of the city, and refining towns such as Baytown grew up because the ship channel provided water access to the Gulf of Mexico. Humble refining company, now Exxon, built what became its largest petrochemical complex in Baytown. And so Barrett Station was an attractive and convenient target for those relocating from Louisiana. They could live nearby in an already well-established community and get to work without trouble. And in 1820, the number of Barrett Station residents reporting Louisiana as their birth state increased from 11 in 1910 to 51 in 1920. The demographics of the community changed in the 1920s, especially after the 1927 flood, which disproportionately affected poor Blacks in the Delta region, and the portions of Louisiana located near the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers, south and west of Baton Rouge. It's likely that relatives and friends formerly from Louisiana suggested to those affected by the flood that they seek opportunities in Texas, and therefore the migration proceeded. Barrett Station attracted a large number of these Black Louisianians, and the community experienced the greatest population growth of its early history during this time. The population of the community expanded from 118 in 1910 to 372 in 1930. Other nearby communities experienced similar growth. Many of the descendants of these Louisiana migrants still reside in Barrett Station today, and they all tell the same story. Now comfortably settled, those earlier migrants probably encouraged the flood victims to move to their area, and such an influx did more than simply add to the population of Barrett Station. Most of the Louisianians included many mixed race, light-skinned Creoles who introduced the French culture of Southeast Louisiana, who introduced the French culture of Southwest Louisiana to their new community. As well as bringing their families, they brought cultural change to Southeast Texas. Such a transformation included exotic foods such as gumbo, jambalaya, boudin, musical forms such as zydeco, and new family names such as Arsenault, Fontenot, and Thibodeau. The heritage of the present-day Barrett Station, of the people of present-day Barrett Station, are so intricately bound up between the states of Maryland, Louisiana, and Texas that it is almost impossible to separate the threads. Even those residents who would come from other areas now claim that heritage as their own. A saying common in the Golden Triangle of Texas that encompasses the cities of Orange, Beaumont, and Port Arthur is true of Barrett Station as well. Quote, "The Cajuns took over Port Arthur without firing a shot," end quote. And Maryland, add Marylanders to that mix, and the result is Barrett Station. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our next presenter, who is D. Caleb Smith from Tulane University, and he's going to speak on his paper, Victory After the Empire Falls, Black Aluminum Workers and 2 Decades of Struggle for Promotion.
Thank you, Share my screen. On June 13th, 1984, the Daily Review of Morgan City, Louisiana featured a column titled "Suit Result Stands." It stated that the United States Supreme Court refused to review an 18-year-long legal struggle of a Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation worker who successfully sued the company over racial discrimination. A black laborer by the name of Harris A. Parson began his legal case against Kaiser in 1966 after the company failed to promote him to the position of foreman. He claimed that the company's decision to deny him promotion was racially motivated. After a 1980 trial, the U.S. District Court of New Orleans awarded Parson more than $113,000 in back pay and interest, and roughly $3 million for individuals, other African Americans, a part of the class action lawsuit. The Fifth U.S. Circuit of Appeals upheld the decision in March of 1984. The U.S. Supreme Court's decision did not review the case, finalized the previous ruling and back pay award. The result of the Parson versus Kaiser case symbolized a complex victory for the black workers of Chalmette. The lawsuit ended during the height of deindustrialization, a period when industries began massive layoffs around the nation. Ironically, during the same period, legal activism resulted in better defining discrimination, offering job advancements for many minorities, especially black workers. By the time notable civil rights lawyers Niels Douglas of the Congress of Racial Equality and Richard Sobel of the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee solidified a victory for Parson and other black workers, high energy costs and worldwide aluminum surplus brought Kaiser's industrial empire to its knees. By 1985, Kaiser's Chalmette plant only consisted of 100 workers total. Many of the black workers involved in the Parson versus Kaiser case no longer labored in the plant at the time they saw victory in the Louisiana judicial system. Their story of legal activism and the fall of one of the world's largest reduction plants causes one to question whether the workers could claim victory after workplace doors were closed. The 1964 Civil Rights Act left the success of the labor movement at the hands of lawyers and judges. For many African American workers like Harris Parson, black law firms would be the center of success or failure. The essay asserts that the 1964 law failed to clearly define discrimination, which led to prolonged racist practices in the workplace, which also halted black labor advances around the nation. It situates the fight against workplace discrimination in the midst of the industrialization. This essay uses Parsons' 18-year-long struggle to argue that the 1964 law was relatively weak until the mid-1970s, and only an opportunity as black workers and lawyers shaped the law's effectiveness. It wasn't until the 1980s that employment law began to fully mature. As seen in the Parson versus Kaiser case, it is in this decade that the courts developed a remedy of back pay that addressed discrimination practices that froze black workers and low-level jobs. The Parson versus Kaiser case begins with the Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation's expansion to Louisiana. The company's Chalmette plant was the backbone of the St. Bernard Parish's economy for nearly 30 years since its establishment in 1951. For 3 decades, the plant churned out 270,000 metric tons of metal a year and employed 2,700 workers, as its payroll rose to a high of $95 million annually. The Chalmette plant was Kaiser's second endeavor in the state, with its first in Baton Rouge. By 1960, Kaiser sought endeavors in Australia and New Zealand. 2 years after the Oakland, California-based company created the Kaiser Aluminum and McKinney Company in the Republic of South Africa and the Kaiser Aluminum Work in West Germany. Looking at racial discrimination in Chalmette, Louisiana at the Kaiser Corporation plant and exploring workplace discrimination on the shop floor. First, looking at the EEOC investigation of the Kaiser plant. In the investigation of Harris A. Parson, the EEOC found that racial discrimination existed at the time the agency received complaints. Both management and local 225 union admitted that the company removed all blacks only and whites only signs with within the plant in 1964, but segregated locker rooms, lunchrooms, and drinking fountains were still present in Kaiser Chalmette plant at the time Parson filed his complaint. After an on-site visit to Kaiser's Chalmette plant, the EEOC confirmed that the statements of Parson were true. Lunchrooms, shower rooms, locker rooms, and other spaces within the facility all had dividing walls to designate which areas African Americans and whites could use. Drinking fountains were electric coolers from which whites drank, and an auxiliary unit fed by pipes from the parent fountain in which African Americans drank. Kaiser Chalmette plant housed shower and locker rooms in two buildings near the main gate. In the case of the lunchrooms, African Americans ate downstairs and whites ate upstairs. The African American sections of the facility were small and poorly lit. The EEOC poster was only found on one bulletin board throughout the plant. This board was used by visitors to the plant. The EEOC concluded that segregated facilities and discrimination in employment practices would not be eliminated until Kaiser and the local 225 union actively worked together to improve the situation. The union insisted that all employees be assigned locker space. Since race dictated locker spaces, if there was no lockers in the African American space, then white applicants would be hired and black applicants would be denied. The EEOC argued that locker assignments held the key to explain the racial disparities of employment opportunities and facilities within the plant. The EEOC found reasonable cause to believe that Kaiser and the local 225 union engaged in discriminatory practices, and after attempting a cure by arbitration, issued Parson a right to sue in August of 1967. Harris A. Parsons' court case, his first trial is not until 1973. Looking at Cowles versus Phillips, which is the first Title VII case to overturn what's known as seniority suicide. This case happens in Virginia, and basically the courts ruled that for African Americans to be forced to forfeit their seniority when asking for promotion was also unlawful. The United States versus Local 89, the Hicks versus Crown Zeller batch cases derived in Bogalusa, Louisiana. Both of these cases were also handled by the same lawyers for the Parson versus Kaiser case. You see Niels Douglas to the top of the Congress of Racial Equality and Richard Sobel of the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee in the middle, and Harris Parson at the bottom. Of these two cases, Hicks was the most notable in the sense that it was the first test to overturn biased employment. It was the first case to overturn biased employment tests in the workplace. Griggs versus Duke Power Company is the first Supreme Court decision of Title VII, which takes place in North Carolina. The ruling in that case Supreme Court noted that only prerequisites that were deemed necessary for job descriptions could be allowed in the workplace. And Roe versus General Motors noted that statistical and data disparities within the workplace could be seen as a mechanism for understanding and citing discrimination. The Parson trials. Parson trials, as noted before, does not come to the Eastern District Court of Louisiana until 1973. However, a decision was not rendered until 1974. As you see in the first bubble, the process for the selection of judges is untainted by any overtones of racial discrimination. Judge Casper in 1974 judged Harris Parsons' claim as his claim was given or first proposed in 1974. At the time, there were 2 African Americans in supervisor positions. However, they were also supervisors in the janitorial departments. It is in 1978 that the appeals court, which see Judge John R. Brown, overturns this decision and blatantly clarifies the errors in which Casabry noted in his first decision. And that 1978 decision was also reaffirmed in 1980. the empire falls, justice or victory after workplace doors are closed. With failed union and company negotiations to reopen the plant, the Parsons case still haunted the Kaiser Corporation 2 years after its settlement. In December of 1987, the Crowley Post-Signal mentioned the 18-year-long discrimination case in conversation with Kaiser's industrial downfall. The corporation sought reimbursement for the insurance for over $3 million in damages the firm had to pay for discriminating against Black workers in Chalmette after the final 1985 trial. The Fifth U.S. Court Circuit of Appeals upheld a lower court ruling that said Kaiser failed to give the insurance company in North America written notice of litigation in a timely manner. The fact that the Kaiser Corporation took the insurance company in North America to court in attempts to retain damages paid from Parsons' lawsuit years one to question the role in which the court case played a role in the plant's definite closure. It is unreasonable to argue that the 18-year-long legal struggle solidified the downfall of the Chalmette plant. However, it can be argued that it played a role, even if a minor one. The newspapers that cite layoffs and union negotiations during the 1980s are not race-specific. The archival records that pertain to the court case do not mention how many Black workers were laid off or how many were working at the time the numbers diminished in the plant. With less than 100 workers total in the plant as of 1985, the majority of the once 400 Black workers in the plant were obviously displaced. The period in which Black workers received back pay was a blessing in disguise. At least they left with some financial pay, which was more than Kaiser could pay workers, Black or white, during the period of massive layoffs. If the Black workers had won in 1973, Kaiser would have been forced to promote them. However, there was no escaping the layoffs of the 1980s. With the Supreme Court denying review of Parsons' individual case in 1984 and the final settlement for the class approved in early of January of 1985, the courts did not take into account the diminishing workforce at the Kaiser plant and calculated Parsons' back pay according to the difference between a foreman's salary and wages he actually earned during the period from September 1967 to June 1982. The courts had adjusted Parsons' pension accordingly. As for the other African-American workers of the plant, the Louisiana District Court awarded back pay with pension adjustments based on individual claims. As a group, they received a substantial financial award that Kaiser could not afford to pay employees at all three Louisiana plants combined. From a pessimistic view, the Parsons case is only a minimal or a limited victory. When considering the back pay settlements took place after the plant fell to its knees, the law never corrected discrimination in the plant. Harris A. Parsons and the rest of the African-American employees involved in the case received justice only through financial remedy. Throughout the duration of the court case, Black workers still labored in the same departments as they did when the 1973 trial took place. Parsons himself was never promoted to the position of foreman. Whether the story of Black workers in Chalmette plant is one of simply justice served or limited victory is based on the tone of the reader. Regardless of how the story is viewed, the Parsons case has a place in legal and labor history. The case is well cited from law reviews and affirmative action in the workplace to textbooks explaining the development of employment discrimination law. Courts outside Louisiana used the 1978 appeals court decision in the Parsons legal struggle as a precedent in other Title VII cases in the future. That's going to wrap it up for me.
We've got a few minutes left.
All right, so I guess we'll look at, stop sharing my screen. Look at the big questions. Why does Harris Parsons and his story actually matter? Harris Parsons is no extraordinary civil rights figure or activist. He's an example of an everyday activist. He's an example of an everyday activist and a Black worker that saw expectations, shaped the law, and used it as a tool to make change in the workplace. Looking at the historiography of Louisiana labor history and the Black freedom struggle here in the city and in the Crescent City, as well as the state and the southern region, we see that, specifically looking at Louisiana, that we don't have a civil rights story, a civil rights history that is approached through labor and a legal lens. That was first led me to this project. And looking into the larger trajectory of work being done on labor, it also furthers the assertions of Jacqueline Dowd Hall and the long civil rights movement, also pushing that spectrum to the right further and challenging how we look at the post-1965 period and not giving all the attention to Black power, as the Black consciousness sought a different means or different methods in the workplace through this 1964 law. That'll be it.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to move on to Lynn A. Cowles from Nicholls State University is going to deliver her paper called Doing What She Had to Do. Leah Chase, Dorothy Mae Taylor, Sybil Haydale Morial, and New Orleans Life After the Civil Rights Movement. I don't hear Lynn.
Got it. Between 1923 and 1932, 3 African-American women were born in New Orleans that would each become quite prominent in their respective communities. Leah Chase, Dorothy Mae Taylor, and Sybil Haydale Morial were all recognized as powerful women within their individual fields, but they shared another commonality. They were each involved with the civil rights movement in New Orleans. Scholars have correctly argued that Black women were the organizers and workers within the movement, and Chase, Taylor, and Morial were no exception. Chase fed activist meals in the restaurant that her husband's family owned, activists that would include Morial's husband, Ernest Dutch Morial. Taylor, as PTA president for 2 schools simultaneously, organized a march to protest discriminatory practices by the Orleans Parish School Board. And as a public school teacher, Morial volunteered to be the plaintiff in a case challenging a law in Louisiana that required school teachers to report memberships in any organization that advocated school integration. Most civil rights activists returned to their regular lives, raising families, working outside their homes as well as within, and going about their daily lives as everyone does. However, Chase, Taylor, and Morial went on to become household names in New Orleans, and even in the case of Chase, around the world. This paper explores why these 3 women from diverse backgrounds became leaders in each of their respective fields, and how their experiences as civil rights activists affected their lives, arguing that although each woman became influential in her own right, their civil rights work was foundational for their later accomplishments. New Orleans, nicknamed the Big Easy, as we all know, is popular for its food, its celebration of life, and its hospitality. Leah Chase, chef at Dookie Chase's restaurant, was internationally famous for her Creole-style cooking. During the civil rights movement, Chase epitomized all 3 characteristics. Not only did she serve food to civil rights activists, but the restaurant was one of the only public restaurants that would serve an integrated table of customers. According to Chase in her Dookie Chase cookbook, upstairs at Dookie's, an additional less formal dining room, was for a long time the center of some of the most interesting political discussions from the early civil rights days to today's city politics, end quote. Chase's involvement in the civil rights movement reflected her ethos of service to her community, which she continued throughout her entire career. In addition to encouraging meetings of civil rights activists, upstairs, Dookie Chase's restaurant also hosted voter registration drives. Martin Luther King Jr. and other members of the Southern Conference of Christian Leadership, as well as other activists in the Black community. In 1961, the New Orleans Black community decided to boycott Mardi Gras in solidarity with the civil rights movement. According to Carol Allen, quote, while the Mardi Gras blackout was a momentous movement within the Black community and an unparalleled stand for principle, Black-owned businesses such as restaurants and taverns took a big financial hit. Leah and Dookie never even blinked. They shut their doors and encouraged their colleagues to do the same. Despite the financial costs of a blackout, the Chases chose to participate in the social justice action encouraging others to join in, and as a result, the boycott was successful. Leah Chase supported her community by maintaining the location of Dookie Chase's restaurant across the street from the Lafitte Housing Project in the predominantly African-American neighborhood known as Treme. Chase explained that once the city desegregated, she was encouraged to move her restaurant to a better area. As she said, Dookie's has been located in the same place in New Orleans for all these years. We've never had a restaurant in our particular community that's lasted this long. It would have been easy to relocate to what some would call a better place. I am a part of this community. I love the people here, and if there's any legacy I leave, it will be that I tried to uplift the people of my community. Dookie Chase's was much more than a simple restaurant where people would go in, be seated, order their meal, eat, pay, and leave. If it had been that type of business, then it would have been much easier for Chase and her husband to move after desegregation. Instead, Chase and her husband created a restaurant that was integral to the community, providing a family-like atmosphere to all who patronized the eatery. New Orleans City Councilwoman Dorothy Mae Taylor made national news with her anti-discrimination ordinance directed at private organizations, including Mardi Gras crews. She challenged an entrenched social framework when she contended that the private clubs prevented African Americans and women equal access to business opportunities. Taylor, however, had a long history of working within the system to change local and state laws to ensure an equitable society that offered opportunity to all, regardless of race, creed, or gender. Taylor's activism dated back to the late 1950s when she served as PTA president for 2 New Orleans elementary schools. Taylor organized a protest march to the Orleans Parish School Board, where she and other activists successfully demanded equal resources for Black schools, including funding and supplies. Taylor also participated in voter registration drives, conducting classes for the Louisiana League of Good Government. Taylor's activism continued long past the end of the traditional period of the Civil Rights Movement. Taylor would become the first African-American woman elected to the Louisiana House of Representatives, filling the position vacated by Dutch Morial when he was elected as the first Black juvenile court judge in Louisiana in 1970. Taylor was a real pathbreaker on issues. She looked at criminal justice reform and healthcare for the poor. Those were her primary issues. In a speech given in 1973, Taylor compared conditions in American prisons to the treatment of POWs by the Viet Cong, stating that the U.S. demands for fair treatment of POWs must also be reflected in the treatment of American prisoners at home. She served as the director of the Central City Health Clinic for several years. She became friends with the deputy director of Charity Hospital, Aretha Castle Haley, who's also well known for her activism in New Orleans. The former mayor of New Orleans, Sidney Bartholomew, said that Taylor was also one of the most loyal advocates of Charity Hospital. She had the support of then Governor Edwin Edwards to improve the quality of services at Charity Hospital. And even though Charity had complaints regarding wait times, it was no secret that people who were very sick, even those with insurance, knew where to go to get quality treatment. Taylor viewed healthcare as a human right and worked to ensure that everyone in Louisiana, including prisoners, had access to basic care. Her most famous effort to ensure equality in private organizations, including Mardi Gras crews and luncheon clubs, occurred while she sat on the New Orleans City Council. On August 30th, 1988, after a meeting that included Taylor, Deputy Chief Attorney Bruce Nakari, representatives from the League of Women Voters and other interested parties, a memo was drafted to City Attorney Okla Jones, notifying him of a decision to hold a public hearing to discuss a proposal to prohibit discrimination in all clubs not distinctly private. She eventually started receiving letters in favor of and in opposition to the proposed ordinance. Those who opposed the regulation argued that everyone had the right to associate with whom they chose, and that Mardi Gras crews and luncheon clubs were private organizations. There were also letters in support of the suggested ordinance. Interestingly, one of the letters in support uses derogatory language for African Americans, Jews, and Italians, then added the supportive statement that, quote, "We are all brothers and sisters under the skin," end quote. Taylor even received threats from those enraged by her efforts to ensure that African Americans and women were not excluded from membership in these powerful organizations. Those threats illustrated that the racial violence directed against civil rights activists during the 1950s and 1960s had not gone away with the end of Jim Crow. It had simply gone to ground until another opportunity to reinforce white supremacy arose. Eventually, the ordinance passed, but it was toothless by the time it was passed, except that the city was able to deny parade permits to Mardi Gras crews that discriminated, which resulted in mainly Comus from no longer parading. Comus was the first Mardi Gras crew still active. Sybil Morial gained recognition as the wife of Dutch Morial, the first African American to serve in the Louisiana legislature. She campaigned for her husband in all of his election campaigns. She also raised their family of 5 children, all of whom are activists and civic leaders in their own right. However, Sybil Morial has been a leader since the 1950s in the civil rights movement, and that initial experience is reflected throughout her entire career. She was born in 1932, grew up in New Orleans as middle class, the daughter of a physician and a former teacher living in the largely Creole district of the 7th Ward. Her parents entertained, were very active. Her father sat on the New Orleans Urban League board, and her mother led the PTO at Morial School. Her parents were friends with A.P. Turow, who is a prominent African-American attorney with deep roots in the Creole community. Turow worked with the NAACP and worked to achieve equal rights. Later, he will see that he and Dutch Morial ended up practicing law together. They were also close friends with future ambassador and mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young's parents, and Young and Morial played together as children and went to prom together. Sybil met her future husband, Dutch Morial, the summer after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling in 1954. They married in 1955, and they returned to New Orleans in 1956. Dutch Morial began practicing law, working with Turow in civil rights cases for the NAACP. They worked well into the evening, frequently eating dinner upstairs at Dookie Chase's. In 1957, Morial came home and asked his wife if she would be the plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Orleans Parish School Board, and she agreed. However, the case did not progress because the Jim Crow laws that had been implemented by the state legislature were unenforceable. After her first experience as an activist, she continued to work for equality. She founded the Louisiana League of Good Government after she attempted to join the New Orleans chapter of the League of Women Voters, but was turned away due to segregation. The organization worked to educate African Americans on their voting rights and worked to get more Blacks registered. She continued in her role of civic leadership. As mentioned, she was the First Lady of New Orleans, and during that time, she served as president and chair of the committee that created the I've Known Rivers Afro-American Pavilion at the Louisiana World's Exposition. She sat on numerous committees and boards and was recognized for her leadership by many organizations, including the Hope House, where Leah Chase presented her with the Ray of Hope Award. According to the program, Sybil Morial's, quote, immeasurable contributions have been evident as an organizer of the Louisiana League for Good Government, activist in the civil rights movement and Women Against Crime, co-founder and initiator of the Committees on Save Our Schools and Excellence in Education, and members of board and committees. Leah Chase, Dorothy Mae Taylor, and Sybil Haydell Morial all earned respect over their lifetimes of service to their community and the city of New Orleans. Each is known for their community activism and civic leadership. The foundation of their individual successes can all be traced to their activities in the social justice movement of the 50s and 60s, which provided each woman foundations upon which to build their lives.
Wonderful. Thank you. Now we're going to have comments provided by Alecia Long from Louisiana State University.
Thank you, Dr. Ambrose. Hi, everybody. I'm going to do this fairly rapidly so that we have some time for Q&A. But what I want to do with regard to each paper is make just a basic observation about that paper and then raise a particular question for the author to think about as he or she revises that work going forward. And so I'll start with Jeffrey Anderson's paper about Monsieur Denis and Grand Zombie. And one of the things that I was searching for in the beginnings of the paper, although the material in the paper is fascinating, is the argument. And I think we got to the argument at the end when you say because of the fragmentary nature of the evidence, we can't make firm calls about that, but it's still worth looking for what we can extract. And I think you might be right about sort of the contingent nature of the evidence, but I'd push you a little bit to think about how issues of context might help you sharpen the argument of the paper. And by this, I mean, I was really struck by the lateness of the dates that you are using to discuss these people. I mean, the earliest date, if I've read the paper correctly, is 1838 in the Wilmington Advertiser. And that's 3 full decades after the Haitian incursion into New Orleans in 1809, 1810. And so what's interesting to me is that these are showing up in the sources of what I presume are white authors, or in newspapers that are dominated by whites. And it's interesting to me when they're showing up, right? They're showing up in a Union newspaper in 1865, and then they're showing up in Le Grand Essimes in 1880, and then in 1904. And that this deity is white probably carries some analytical weight. And so I think there's a lot of really great raw material, and I think you've done a great job sort of extracting out what's available. But I really think about the context of those appearances and the evolution of the identity of those Lois is a sort of way to sort of push this work a little further. So thank you for sharing it, and I certainly was fascinated by it, and your command of a very complex group of terms and sources is commendable, Jeff, so thank you. And I'm not going to say very much about Ron Traylor's paper just because he's not here, but I will say, you know, I think it raises the question of what we can do with very sort of dense genealogical data and how we can sort of put that together to think about the origins of a given place. But what I really found myself wondering about was Barrett Station, and Barrett Station in comparison to the white town of Crosby. And what I really wondered about was whether or not Barrett Station had its own administrative structure, if it had its own law enforcement, if it is surrounded by sundown towns in other parts of Texas. And so I think Barrett Station's sort of future is as important to understanding why people from Louisiana found it such an appealing place after the 1927 flood. And so I'll be happy to sort of communicate with Dr. Traylor about that once he is working on this project again. And then I'm going to go to Caleb Smith's paper, and I got to read a longer version of this paper, and it is part of what I think is going to be a very promising dissertation, and one that the author says situates Black workers and lawyers as leaders in the workers' rights campaign and sort of reinterprets civil rights history for us. And one of the things that I think is a really good question you're asking is why defining discrimination was such a tough challenge to both lawyers and judges in the 1960s. And I think one place that you might go try to find some comparative answers for that question is in looking at the extensive litigation led by A.P. Turow in the late 40s and early 50s about equalization of teacher pay, right? Because this is
42.
Right. I mean, this is a process. So they're in court for years and years and years trying to get this kind of equalization. And some of it has to do with Longism, the success of it. But the intricacies of that legal argumentation, I think, might kind of provide an interesting contrast to what you're looking at for the post-Civil Rights Act era and Title VII in particular. So I just encourage you to think about that.
Great idea.
And another sort of comparison, and this is not probably useful except just an observation that occurred to me, is the way that you were explaining the EEOC and its relatively limited ability to do very much with what it observed and talked about, that it was sort of neutered in a way. And it reminded me a lot of the Freedmen's Bureau and what the Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to be able to accomplish, and ultimately what it was really unable to accomplish. I mean, the Freedmen's Bureau, because it was essentially kind of conservative execution of a sort of very liberal vision. But I wonder about that with the EEOC too, as you move forward with the project. And then I think there was one other thing that I wanted to say to you, and I think this is part of your argument, but I'm not sure. And it made me wonder if part of what you're arguing is that the only way we get to something that looks like justice is not just through sort of retributive aspects of civil justice, but also the essential role of remunerative aspects of civil justice. And it might be necessary, in your case, you're talking about the remedy of back pay. But I think there's an important lesson there, and you know this. I mean, I'm just sort of saying this struck me as I was reading it, is that this is kind of an important argument when we're talking about how we get to justice. And we look at relative economic outcomes for African Americans and whites in this country. And so then you have this Parsons case where this remunerative justice that they received provided a cushion for them and their families, I presume, for some period of time. So this is an exciting project, and I look forward to seeing it develop over time. And then Lynn, who I've known for some time and who I want to congratulate as a full-time archivist, who is also using the records that she is processing as an archivist to research and write history. So I want to commend you for that, because that's a second job on top of the full-time job that you have serving as an archivist around those records. And so I want to kind of just briefly say, you sort of provide us these sort of capsule biographies out of papers that you are processing of these three pretty extraordinary women in New Orleans history. And I think all that's really important. And what I wanted to say about these women is, I think your argument that the experience that they gain in the civil rights movement, sort of laying a template for their future success, is important. But I also would encourage you to sort of think about like what the larger contextual recipe is for success in the cases of all three of those women. Because what I saw when I was thinking about them, kind of pulled back, to 30,000 feet over what you were arguing, is that for all of these women, they may be extraordinary individuals, but each one of them is really deeply embedded in a community. And I would say a rather supportive community. So that's really important. And each one of those women also had some form of economic security or autonomy, right? And in that particular way, I think it's important, not just so much with Leah Chase, but with the other two subjects, to think about the context of a public sector that was open to offering varieties of people across race lines, in particular, various ways of earning a competency, right? So Dorothy Mae Taylor works at Charity Hospital and the Charity Hospital system, right? I think I've got that right, if I'm not sort of confusing these. Or Morial works in the education system, where the Black middle class had a big foundation pre-Katrina. So I think that thing of, some form of economic security or autonomy. And then the other piece of this that I saw was that they also existed in a period of time where there was a legislative terrain open to creating mechanisms for equality, right? And then adjudicating what those things were. So in some ways, their big accomplishments sort of predate the rise or the repackaging of the right and white supremacy in the South. And so some of it has to do with the moment in which these women not only are activists, but then mature and impact their community.
Yeah.
So all those things, I think, are ways to think about how to sort of make a more parallel analysis of your three subject women. And then finally, I'll just close with a question that was sort of thrumming in the back of my mind as I read all of these papers. And I mean, in a way, it's the obvious one, which is that I couldn't help but think of our current moment and the urgent calls for racial justice. But it's not just those calls for racial justice, it's the emerging debates about how we get to it, right? And I think your papers have things to tell us and to tell the larger communities with which you share this work, not only about how to understand the historical moments that you're describing, but how certain individuals navigate those kinds of contingencies and opportunities and contributed to positive social change. So I will stop there, and I don't see any questions in the chat. So I would just give it back to the speakers and ask if any one of them wants to answer the question I posed, or wants to tell me to shut up and talk about whatever else they want to talk about. So thank you all very much. And thanks for being here this afternoon, everybody else who is here with us.
So Jeff, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for your comments. And I will say, I hope maybe I addressed it a little bit more fully, and my point is a little bit more clear in the whole thing. It's what I presented was a very short selection of about a 40-something page chapter. And that doesn't mean it made any more sense or was more direct in that big chapter, who knows. But my strategy for this was really just cut out everything I could and then talk really fast, so I could get everything into like a 15-minute time frame. But I'll definitely look at that. And your comment on context, that's something that's always fascinated me a lot, just to add into what you were saying. The song I put up there about Simbe, that one itself you could write probably an essay on. One thing I found about that is, to my knowledge, no one's really looked at that a whole lot. There's a translation issue. What is it even saying? For instance, when I brought it to a group of Bakongo speakers, their interpretation of it, which I didn't address in the paper, I do in the bigger one, but I didn't today, was that it's not talking about deity at all, that it is talking about taking hold of. And that it's, well, the way it was reported, that ceremony was trying to help the Confederacy regain control of New Orleans, and the Voodoos were trying to support the Confederacy, hence the Union interfering. There are some
And that sure is a white story right there, isn't it?
Well, you know, it's plausible though, when you look at who's involved, because you're talking a lot of freed African Americans. You know, who knows whether Marie Laveau was involved? She's of course a slaveholder. A lot of these people were not necessarily, it's not as improbable as it might sound like it is. And who knows? But yeah, it is coming from a white perspective, a Union perspective, anti-voodoo, a lot of other things that would be talked about. But you've got that really, really, I don't know, there's a lot you can deal with context, like you say. So just, I guess what I really said in a lot of words is, I agree.
Okay. So let's go ahead and hear from D. Caleb Smith.
I really appreciate Professor Long's commentary. Definitely timely, as I just officially entered candidacy last week. So to have those comments in the early writing stages are definitely needed and necessary to carry on through the next 1.5, 2 years of writing.
I wanted to say that another interesting comparison with the Freedmen's Bureau is the FEPC, which is a definite forerunner of the EOCC, and in the way that they were neutered, all of them. It's always amazed me, but of course that's the reality. And so there's a parallel there too. Okay, Ms. Lynn Cowles.
Alecia, thank you. You've given me a lot to think about, particularly, and that was something that I couldn't get into as it was a conference paper, you know, so short. But the community, and you're right, the community is key to all three women and all of the others. I don't know if I'm sure you noticed, most likely, But all of these women and other people kept turning up in each other's stories. Every document, you know, everything that happened, or not everything, but frequently when one event affected one person, one of the other ladies was in there. So I would like to expand on this and submit it somewhere for an article eventually.
Okay, Alecia, did you want to say anything more?
No, I think I have sort of said what I needed to say in terms of observations and questions. I think it's sometimes a challenge when the papers are so various to sort of come up with something that's holding them all together. But I think, you know, one of the things that's holding them all together is to try to think about, despite sometimes fragmentary evidence or sometimes stories being pushed to the side because they don't look like civil rights in the way that we've kind of come to understand it in a sometimes very two-dimensional way. I just commend you all for sort of looking more deeply into these questions and thinking about all the different ways that people can be activists and how these histories have things to tell us, not just about the past, but that inform our current moment. So and I'm on to blathering, so I'll stop blathering.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Long. Would anyone else like to add anything?
Well, I actually have a question, it looks like in the chat, directly from Dr. Robertson.
Oh, here, let me read
Here
it.
we are.
Do you want me to read it out?
Sure.
Jeff, are you finding that Haiti's culture or Africa has more influence on the spirits mentioned in Louisiana, or is it a blend?
Well, it's really difficult to sort some of that out. And that's, you know, I really set out with some of this research I was doing to try to sort it out. And I've kind of come to the conclusion that I cannot absolutely sort it out. But if you look at like Haiti and you're looking at the blending of spirits and the religion there, I suspect that what we today call Haitian Vodou was originally several different distinct religions that eventually came to be seen as one religion with different parts. That's where you get like different nations of spirits in Haiti. And then when you look here in like Louisiana, you don't see those different nations, at least not clearly. You do see that, yes, this particular spirit came from one part of Africa, this other spirit came from another part of Africa, but there's no surviving record of people distinguishing that, stating that these come from different places. That doesn't seem to be there. And is that just because the documentation is not there, or is it because people didn't think in those terms? It's hard to say, but what I really feel like probably happened from the little bit of detail you can get, because there is a reference to what today we would look back and say was a voodoo ceremony from about the 1730s, but it's a very, very one-line reference. And so you can't tell much from it. You have the Grigri case in the 80s, I think. I need to go back and check that. When you have that, the term Grigri, which is probably from the Senegal, or somewhere around there, that area is a widespread term, but probably from that area. It's being used for what we today would call hoodoo, but that's kind of part of voodoo in that context. You see that kind of thing. So there's something there beforehand. But then the Haitian immigration is so big that it's hard to sort, okay, did things come directly from Africa? Did they come from Haiti? And I think sometimes you can say this comes directly from Africa. For instance, Dr. John, if you've heard of him, Jean Montanet, he is, by all accounts, African born and from Senegal, according to what records we have. So this person practicing some form of what we today would call voodoo is practicing what he learned in Senegal, most likely. Now, how much is that separate from a broader voodoo context? That's another matter of interpretation. So it's, again, a lot of it's just really difficult to tell, but I enjoy looking at it because it has a feel of a detective. Well, probably that's not the right thing, but like I'm a detective looking for something. I mean, I know people say that a lot, but that's really what it feels like. It's a lot of fun doing. And by the way, this is not answering the question, but I'm not sure if that's Mary Lynn Wernette here. I believe so. But I want to say that the possibility of even doing some of this research rests heavily upon her, and I owe her a lot of thanks for the help she's given me and the other people over at Northwestern going through some of their archives. So if that's not you, well, hey, pass it on if you see her.
Great. I don't see any more questions as we speak. Would anyone else care to make further remarks? Okay, I think we can close the session. I want to thank everyone for their participation and have a great evening.